In May 2025, the Russians achieved an operational level breakthrough right between Pokrovsk and Toretsk. With this attack, they managed to advance significantly towards Konstantinivka. However, by the first week of June, this attack had been stopped due to the stiffening Ukrainian resistance, and the Russian operation temporarily ran out of steam. The operational level success in May has been followed by another one in June that I have thoroughly described in my previous video. And please let me say a few additional words about it. In this sketch, it is clearly visible that the Russians already had two large operational breakthrough exits by mid-June. Thus, it is also visible that two Ukrainian brigades, namely the 23rd and the 33rd Mechanized, were practically encircled by the 16th of June. But in spite of that, these Ukrainian brigades, who were by the way executing a retrograde operation for more than a week now, didn't receive an order to fully withdraw behind this line marked as phase line Artemis. Instead of this, the 61st Mechanized Infantry Brigade and the 5th Heavy Mechanized Infantry Brigade desperately tried to hold the door open, and only after the Russian success on the 29th they commenced the withdrawal out from the trap. After the Russian breakthrough on the 29th, they transited into the phase of exploitation, thus intended to capture objectives that enhance their freedom of maneuver, while in parallel with that seriously hampers the Ukrainians. They captured the bridgehead on the western bank of the Mokry Yali River near Pidubne, and they achieved a tactical breakthrough near Voskresenka. With these actions, the Russians made the situation of the Ukrainian 141st Mechanized Infantry Brigade untenable. I concluded my previous video with that on the 3rd of July, the Russians commenced to encircle this Ukrainian brigade, which resulted that the 141st had to act quickly or to be destroyed. It was a situation that required fast decisions and close coordination between three brigades. As you can see on the map markings, the 141st commenced a delaying action while the Russians tried to close the trap. The Ukrainians had to fight hard, albeit the Russian situation wasn't rosy at all. The 57th Motorized Rifle Brigade, attacking from the west, had to counter the limited counterattacks of the Ukrainian 31st and 67th Mechanized Infantry Brigades. Therefore, the Russians had only a handful of infantry assault groups to attack against the 141st from the west. The 37th Motorized Rifle Brigade and the 5th Tatsinskaya Separate Guard Tank Brigade, attacking from the east, had a bit easier job, but they had to attack through a tiny but still existing water obstacle. Furthermore, in the first week of July, the 5th Separate Guard Tank Brigade received an order to redeploy near Shevchenka because the open terrain offered better opportunities to exploit their armored capabilities. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, the Russians are always ready to deploy some armored forces, hoping that sometimes they can achieve success. All in all, the Ukrainian 141st Mechanized Infantry Brigade commenced its retrograde operation on the 4th of July, so less than 24 hours after they found themselves in a difficult situation. It seems to be slow, but it is not. Deducting from the fact that this operation was supported by other brigades shaping operations and raw units not subordinate to the 141st, the following could happen in the afternoon of the 3rd of July and late night. First of all, the situation must be recognized by a capable commander who has the authority to do something. In this actual situation, the 20th Army Corps had 4 brigades in the region, and I am sure that its commander was aware of the operational situation by no later than the early evening of the 3rd. And I am also sure that the other units were also aware of the reality. Briefly, the Ukrainian commanders had an up-to-date situational awareness by the afternoon of the 3rd of July. It would have been better to have all present brigades under one unified command, but in this situation it wasn't the case. Therefore, the corps and brigade commanders had to create an ad hoc way of coordination, for which purpose the new Delta Battlefield Information Management System could be ideal, but well-trained high-ranking commanders and officers can find multiple different ways to create a platform for coordination. All in all, my money would go for the 20th Corps commander had a good relation and well-functioning coordination platform with the 5th Heavy Mechanized Infantry Brigade and the 67th Mechanized Infantry Brigade's commander for this actual operation. I am pretty sure that based on their common understanding, the aforementioned commanders and staff officers issued a warning order, or if you like, Warno, by late night of the 3rd of July. In this Warno, they specified the task organization, I mean who is subordinate to who, the type of the mission, in this case a retrograde with supporting operation. They also specified the planned starting time of the mission and the planned time of issuing the final operational order or fragmentary order, depending on the actual administrative situation. Based on my deduction, they also issued a following concept of operation in the Warno or after it. The 5th Heavy Mechanized Infantry Brigade is fully committed towards northeast, holding back the Russian 336th Naval Infantry Brigade, therefore they could only help the 141st with some drone strikes. In order to avoid conflicts, they had to have a clear sector boundary and strictly specify the coordination between the two brigades' drone units. It is even more true in the phases of the maneuvers. Further detailing the CONOP, the maneuvers of the 141st out from the trap had to be closely coordinated with the fixing attacks outside of the cauldron. This coordination had to be planned with significant redundancies and with very clear boundaries. For those who obtain deeper knowledge in the field of land forces operations, I know that I am just scratching the surface. But hence these are only deductions and my other viewers are not professionals. I consider this depth of analysis enough in this regard. But I very much hope that even with this superficial analysis, I could present to my dear viewers a complex nature of military operations like this. I am pretty sure that there are no wonder weapons in any war. However, a well-organized and well-led military decision-making process is pretty close to be the one. We really don't know what happened exactly, but what we know is that the 141st successfully broke contact and reached the line that I marked as phase line bare, stretching between Shevchenka and Vesele. So it seems that on the first day everything went well. It is even more true if we consider the fact that the Russians quickly realized what is happening and the 57th and 37th Motorized Rifle Brigades deployed their infantry assault groups. But thanks to the careful Ukrainian planning, the further Russian progress had been stopped by drones, artillery, and adequately positioned forces. On the next day, the 6th of July, the Ukrainians continued their operation and they successfully reached the line marked as phase line Cat, just above the previous day's Russian attacks. It seems to be easy, but it is not. The Russians deployed artillery and drones trying to inflict as many casualties as possible, and of course the 60th Motorized Rifle Brigade exerted pressure from the south. In the meantime, I also have to mention the 5th Heavy Mechanized Infantry Brigade. This unit firmly held the line facing the Russian 37th Motorized Rifle Brigade and later the 336th Naval Infantry Brigade, while constantly adjusted its area of responsibility towards north in close coordination with the 141st Mechanized Infantry Brigade's delaying action. All of this could be achieved thanks to the following. The Russian 5th Separate Guard Tank Brigade was in the process of redeployment to the western bank of the Mokry Yali River, as I mentioned earlier. Speaking of redeployment and readjustment, however, I have thoroughly described in my previous video that the Russians need 2 to 3 days of readjustment after a tactical level success, and they need 5 to 7 days of readjustment after an operational level success. In this exact situation, the Russians achieved a great operational victory by an operation which culminated by the 2nd of July. Therefore, this time frame was perfectly in the middle of the Russian divisions readjusting their units, artillery, electronic warfare, but first of all logistic systems. All of this greatly helped the Ukrainians. The next 2 days, the 7th and 8th of July, brought a lull in the fight. As far as we know right now, based on scarcely available open source information, the Ukrainians didn't continue their delaying action. This can have only one reason. The strategic level command intervened and halted the retrograde operation. This is only my deduction, but I cannot imagine any other reason why would anyone stop a nicely going, extremely difficult operation. All in all, the 141st and the 5th Brigades reached the line that I marked as phase line Dino on the 9th, and they held this line until the 15th of July, when the Russians pushed them back to a line which practically strengthened the line of contact. This concludes the follow-up analysis of the events that I described in my previous video. What I wanted to highlight is that based on scarcely available open sources, it seems that the Ukrainians managed to plan, organize, lead, and execute a coordinated action of 3 or 4 brigades. This is something that we couldn't observe since October 2022 in the Ukrainian side. If the Ukrainians will be able to keep up this level of coordination and spread it throughout the front, they can improve their chances avoiding defeats like Vuhledar, Velika Novosilka, Ulakli, or the one that I presented in my previous video. And now, let's turn our attention to Pokrovsk, where the next great battle has already commenced. As I mentioned earlier, the Russian offensive in May achieved its greatest success between Pokrovsk and Toretsk. But this great success in itself was the reason of the Russians stopping for readjustment. All of this resulted that in the first half of June, mostly recon by force missions and drone battles were going on in this sector, and by the 12th of June the Russians reached this thick red line. Both warring parties were very busy in the first half of June. The Russians were readjusting their combat support and combat service support systems and regrouped their forces for the next attack, while the Ukrainians were also busy with sending reinforcements, fortifying positions, and most importantly, they were desperate to find a countermeasure to the presence of the Russian Rubicon Center drone unit. Thanks to this drone unit, the Russians enjoyed an overwhelming superiority in terms of drones, something like they had in Kursk back in February this year. By the 11th of June, both warring parties knew that a new operational phase will commence soon. As I described in my earlier videos, the Russians are always trying to capture areas from which they can attack into multiple directions, and they do this at all 3 levels of military activities. In this exact situation, they could advance north, further threatening Konstantinivka. But they also had the chance, with the same amount of logic behind it, to attack northeast to threaten the Ukrainians fighting near Toretsk. And they also had the chance to go west and continue the encirclement of Pokrovsk, which his previous attempt had been stopped by the Ukrainians early this year. Needless to say that these options put a heavy pressure on the Ukrainian defenses. The Russians made their decision, which resulted that on the 12th they commenced their operation. On this day, according to their well-known and battle-proven methods, the Russians launched small recon by force missions throughout the whole area of operations. The 2 operations at Malinivka and Miralyubivka achieved some success. It is not a coincidence, hence the Russians executed here not just one recon by force mission, but they deployed another assault group in the second echelon, and they managed to penetrate to the tactical depths of the Ukrainian defenses. The Russians masterfully camouflaged their original intention. Speaking of the Russians masterfully doing something, they shifted their center of gravity at the operational level from the sector of the 5th and 39th Motorized Rifle Brigades to the 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade. This latter unit deployed at least 2 complete assault companies supported with more than adequate artillery and managed to break through the Ukrainian defenses. Based on open sources and deducting from the terrain, the Russians deployed infantry assault groups in the first echelon in the early morning, and they have managed to capture these 3 lines before noon. After these successes, the NCOs responsible for artillery fires, the so-called Karekkirovchiki, adjusted the artillery fire and softened the hastily occupied second echelon Ukrainian battle positions. In perfectly close coordination with this, the Russians deployed their second echelon assault company, presumably on motorbikes deducted from their speed. This company decisively defeated the Ukrainians facing them and executed a tactical breakthrough by capturing the village of Kapteve. With these 3 tactical breakthroughs, the Russians pushed the Ukrainian defenses off balance, but it seems that these successes put a large stress on the Russians too. On the 14th, they executed only small-scale mop-up operations between Mykolaivka and Malinivka. On the 16th, they launched a small attack near Radivka in order to keep the Ukrainians occupied and slightly off balance. And on the 17th, they advanced 1 kilometer towards west near Malinivka. By the 17th of June, On the fifth day of the offensive of the Russian 68th Army Corps, it was crystal clear that this area became the Russians' main axis of attack. These 4 days, from the 14th to the 17th of June, provided enough time for the 68th Army Corps to readjust its forces to continue the offensive. The 19th of June was the first day of the second phase of the Russian operational level offensive in this region. The 20th Guards Motorized Rifle Division deployed infantry assault groups towards Yablonivka, but it was only an operational level shaping attack. The tactical level shaping attack was launched towards Novaya Kanyamiche by the 5th Motorized Rifle Brigade, but the main attack was launched towards Novatoretsk. As the main operation, the Russians launched a coordinated attack of 3 brigades. The 39th Brigade fixed the Ukrainian Da Vinci Wolves with a frontal attack, while the Russian 57th Regiment attacked the Ukrainian 67th Brigade at its left flank. In close coordination with this, in the center of the main operation, the 9th Russian Motorized Rifle Brigade broke through the Ukrainian lines again and penetrated to the village of Novatoretsk. But the Russians couldn't transit into the exploitation phase. The Ukrainians hastily redeployed reinforcements even since the 17th of June, and their ever-growing numbers made their presence felt. And furthermore, it seems that the Russian 68th Army Corps was slower in readjusting its forces and supporting systems than other units were in the southeastern corner of the front that I presented in my previous video. The only Russian success of this week was a small advance near Popy Vyar. The next week also had been spent with planning and preparations. The Ukrainians received reinforcements in the form of 210th Assault Regiment, and the 14th Chervona Kalina Guards Brigade was in the process of redeployment into this sector. These reinforcements made possible of the redeployment of the Da Vinci Wolves to strengthen the northern flank in case of another surprising Russian shift of center of gravity. The Ukrainians also concentrated drone units, but in the same time the Russians also sent reinforcements and were planning their next coordinated offensive. And of course their drone units and tactical aviation wreaked havoc on the Ukrainian lines. These fire preparations had a significant effect. But before we could go further, I have to draw your attention to one very interesting detail. After the Russian breakthrough to Novatoretsk, this area became a Ukrainian bridgehead east of the Kazany Tarets River. This bridgehead could only be supplied via the N32 highway coming from Pokrovsk and the small bridge south of Razyne. Later it turned out that the river was fordable near the village of Razyne itself. These choke points made it easier for the Russians to isolate and slowly but surely degrade the Ukrainian defenders in the bridgehead. This is something that I called Mini Kherson a couple of months ago, because the first operation like this in this war was the Ukrainian Kherson counteroffensive, and I also described it in my PhD thesis, just saying. In addition to the Ukrainians being in a really uncomfortable situation, they knew that the terrain elevation at the western bank of the river and the river itself provides an ideal defensive position. Therefore, they didn't intend to hold this bridgehead at all costs, and the next Russian attack proved this statement. On the 29th, the Russians obtained an advanced guard position by capturing a tree line southwest of Kopteve. This advance, and the adequate time spent, was a clear signal of the next Russian attack. On the 30th of June, the 9th and 39th Motorized Rifle Brigades launched a coordinated offensive. On the northern flank, the Russians widened their occupied areas in Novatoretsk and managed to advance up to the river 1 kilometer wide. At the southern flank, the 39th Motorized Rifle Brigade deployed an assault company and advanced along the N32 highway towards west. But the main attack had been carried out by at least 2 infantry assault companies of the 39th Brigade in the center. With one well-supported two-pronged attack, they advanced along the tree lines utilizing the cover of drones and artillery fire and captured a significant part of the bridgehead. But they didn't stop here. Like numerous times before, they deployed the second echelon, exploited the tactical level breakthrough, and successfully forded the river at Razyne, and they broke into the village with one infantry assault group. With this operation, the Russians practically destroyed the Ukrainian bridgehead. However, based on openly available Russian sources, the advancing units didn't meet heavy resistance. The Ukrainians executed some delaying actions, but they rather deployed drones only. From this, I can deduct that the Ukrainians anticipated this attack and extracted their forces from another forming cauldron. The next week brought another week-long pause. This time was spent with the usual drone and artillery strikes by both warring parties. It was clear that the Russians will have two main directions of attack: their tiny bridgehead near Razinya, and the Ukrainian bridgehead with its crossing point at Novoekonomice. Both was a difficult task. At Razinya, the very small extent of the bridgehead in itself seriously hampered the Russians concentrating more than one assault group there. The bridgehead at Novoekonomice, however, offered an opportunity worth risking. If the Russians could launch a coordinated attack and break through the tactical depths of the Ukrainian defenses, they could be able to seize the key bridge on the N32 highway. The Ukrainian bridgehead was quite exposed, therefore the Russians decided to take a chance on it. The Russians intended to exploit the element of surprise, and they deployed a mechanized infantry platoon of the 1472nd Motorized Rifle Regiment without any fire preparation. But the Ukrainians were aware, prematurely detected the Russian attempt and destroyed the Russian platoon well before they could have reached the assault departure line. On the 9th of July they tried the same again, but now directly from the east. But this attack failed spectacularly, just like the previous one. I don't understand why the Russians tried to achieve success this way. Maybe they hope that the Ukrainians don't expect something this stupid. And you know, if something is stupid but works, it ain't stupid. But it was. This statement of mine is even more true if we consider the fact that 2 days later, on the 11th of July, the Russians exploited the low water caused by the summer heat and forded the Kazany Tarets River. They used the cover of the swampy, forested patch north of Razinya and advanced 1 kilometer deep and 1 kilometer wide. Parallel with that, they realized that it is still better to deploy infantry than armored assets, and pushed the Ukrainians out from the bridgehead east of Mykolaiivka, facing only minor Ukrainian delaying actions and drone attacks. On the next day, the Russians maintained the pressure on their Schwerpunkt. They advanced a bit southwest from their little salient near Razinya. On the 13th, they continued their activities and deepened their penetration into another tactical breakthrough towards west. The main reason why they could advance this easily can be that this direction was a dead end. The water reservoirs, causeways, and the built-up areas provided ideal defensive positions for the Ukrainians to which they could fall back. But these positions were serious obstacles in the back of the Ukrainians, further underlying the necessity of their forces withdrawing from Razinya. Of course, the Russian breakthrough near Razinya posed a serious threat, but it was still a manageable situation, and if the Ukrainians would have decided to tenaciously hold their trap positions, it would have resulted in another disaster. On the 13th, the Russians advanced up to the line of terrain obstacles, and they even tried to advance through the gap between the two water reservoirs. But the Ukrainians were aware, and they adequately concentrated drones and artillery and infantry reserves in order to be able to react to a situation like this. Thus, it is no surprise that by the end of the 13th, this Russian attempt had been eliminated. On the data cut-off day of this video, which is the 21st of July, the front was stationary for another week. Only some positional battles happened south of Fedorivka, where the Russians slowly closed in on the terrain obstacles. Based on what we have seen, it is highly likely that the Russians will launch their next attack in the coming days. But what we have learned from all of this? Well, in chronological order, the Russians managed to exploit the element of surprise by attacking towards west instead of north. With this, and with all their battle-proven offensive methods, they managed to achieve two tactical-level breakthroughs. But these breakthroughs had always been halted before they could achieve that huge success like they did in June in the southeastern corner. This is largely because the terrain here helped the defender. And speaking of the defender, it seems, at least from open sources, that the Ukrainians here had managed to get themselves together. What I mean is that it is suspicious that the Russians could only break through into directions which led them into dead ends. I don't say that it is perfectly aligned with the Ukrainian intentions, far from it. What I say is that the Ukrainian commanders and staffs adequately analyzed the situation and always strengthened the most critical areas. The adequate grouping of forces is the key to any kind of defensive success. I don't say that it is 100% true, but this is the result of my analysis based on open sources. The other important thing that I see is that the Russian operational tempo seems to be slightly reduced. In their operational level victories in May and June, the Russians needed 2 to 3 days between tactical level breakthroughs and 7 to 10 days between operational level attacks. In this actual situation, however, they needed 7 days between 2 tactical level breakthroughs and they needed 1 month to launch another operational level offensive. I want to very much underline that it's just a superficial observation based on open sources. We still have to wait for at least a month to see what is the trend in the real life. Both warring parties can improve largely, and President Trump's 50-day ultimatum can have an effect. However, I don't think that it will be materialized at the end. Anyway, that is all that I wanted to say for now. Thank you very much for watching. If you think my job worth it, please give this video a like, share it and subscribe to my channel. If you have anything to add, I am more than happy to see it in the comments. Thank you and see you soon.